to start with, I'll just tell you a little bit about our Iregan Advisors for any of you who aren't familiar with what we do. We're a consulting business. We work, with public and private companies across Ireland and internationally. One of our specialisms is in the area of mobility and parking. It's an area I've worked in myself for many years, and we help local authorities to design, digitalise and improve the customer experience of their mobility and parking services. Alongside that, we also provide, expert services and our advisory services to bodies like the Department of Transport. I'm currently part of, for example, a working group that's helping the department in developing the National Demand Management Strategy, and that's really something that's going to be of interest, I think, in the coming years. The demand management strategy is really about, how to encourage the behavioural shift away from private car use for those who can do so. And it's a really interesting group. It's made up of local authorities, disability advocates like Sinead Burke, Minister Eamon Ryan's part of that as well. So that's what another part of our kind of transport and mobility services. We also help local authorities, translate their sustainable mobility strategy into operational action, actually operationalizing strategy. And we also help local authorities with tenders and supporting them with the actual procurement processes. So just getting into the subject, or what we want to talk about today, and the first thing really is to address what do we mean when we speak about accessible mobility and parking. And I suppose, firstly, it's important to be aware that it's a wide stakeholder ecosystem. We're obviously focusing today on people with mobility needs, but, there are a lot of other stakeholders in that ecosystem when we talk about accessibility. On a previous webinar, for example, our last one, we spoke about people with literacy needs and how to design your communication strategy with, as broad an audience as possible in mind. Something that people are becoming much more aware of nowadays as well, for example, is, motorists with cognitive or neurodiversity needs. And again, it's really important, because that's ever evolving, to be aware that it's quite a broad ecosystem, and hopefully today will help in terms of, at least your development of part of that. So the first piece of national policy context I want to touch on is the National Sustainable Mobility Policy. And many of you may be familiar with this. It was published last year. The SNP sets out how as a country we will make the shift to sustainable transport modes. And I know some of you are actively involved in that work, within, different local authorities or regional bodies. But throughout the SNP, it emphasised, accessibility. It emphasised the need to, make our walking, cycling and public transport systems more accessible for people with disabilities. The principle of access for all was mentioned throughout the document. And, the strategy itself was designed and really kind of predicated on things like the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the Irish Disability Act and various other Irish national policies. So the point of this slide, I suppose, basically is to say that, there is, very strong national policy support in the area of transport and mobility specifically, to make sure that your transport and mobility services at a local level are as accessible as possible. These are two other things that I thought would be of interest. Firstly, the Climate Action Plan, which was published at the end of last year, mentioned that, planning authorities shouldn't require specific minimum levels of car parking, except for disabled parking. So again, recognizing in the Climate Action Plan that while, you won't be encouraging and designing lots of car parking into urban developments or town centres going forward, that disabled parking is an area that should be prioritised. And there was another study done in 2021 for the 5 cities, but I think it's equally applicable to any local authority, any urban town centre, and that was general support for stronger enforcement of parking, including illegal parking in disabled spaces, parking on pavements and so on. And that came across in this study, very strongly from the piece of public consultation work that they did. So moving on from that, this is a case study I thought might be of interest, and some of you may be familiar with the Dublin City Council Transport Plan, which was published a few weeks ago. And one part of that kind of resonated with me and I thought was very relevant to what we're talking about today was a section that was titled The City of Equality. And that part of the DCC Transport Plan had some really positive ideas about consultation with stakeholders, and that consultation would be done and would be sought on an ongoing basis with stakeholders. And also that, for example, that all major transport and public realm schemes will be subject to an equality impact assessment. And equality in the context of the plan, as I mentioned it here, really means, ensuring equal access for people to the various modes of transport, whether that's, public transport in your city or your town or private car use, but that it would be as accessible as possible and that you would, on a regular basis, consult with the stakeholders that are part of that ecosystem I mentioned earlier. So now to get into a little bit more granular detail, because this is something I'm regularly asked about, is about the design of accessible parking, and particularly how much accessible parking should I be allocating in my town centre, or where should they be located and so on. And there's loads of resources out there. There's loads of information available that I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with. This here is taken from the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, and that's an Irish body that's established by the National Disability Authority. I'll let Tony speak to the IWA guidelines. The IWA has a really excellent set of guidelines around design from an accessibility perspective as well. But two things that I'd note here that I think are of interest, it's generally recommended 6 or 7% of the total capacity of, like a parking development should be given to accessible spaces. I think that kind of correlates with the IWA's recommendations as well. And if you look at the total number of disabled parking permit holders as a percentage of the whole private vehicle estate in Ireland, it more or less correlates also. But what I will say is that, when you're designing your transport and mobility plans going forward, and, you're encouraging more active travel use, you're giving over some of your, really, really precious and valuable town centre space, either to public transport or public realm developments, it's really worth considering, why that oughtn't to be higher. If there's certainly categories of private car user, like, people with mobility needs who need the access, who need to be, able to park more centrally, and any of us who thankfully don't need to might be able to park in that nice car park you built 5 minutes walk away that nobody uses because it's 5 minutes walk away. So there's no reason why that 6% shouldn't or couldn't be 15 or 20%, and I think you'd certainly find support amongst your public if you communicate that the right way. And where they should be located is an important consideration as well, and depending on the layout of your town or where the key attractions or retail units are, the recommendation is generally that they be located within 25 meters. Another source of information I'm sure many people will be familiar with is the Department of Transport Traffic Signs Manual. And as I mentioned as well, the IWA has an excellent set of guidelines that can support you with that too. If you have any questions as you're designing it yourself, feel free to give me a shout anytime as well. So just a couple of quick slides here about kind of international best practices that might be of interest, and just a sample of what's done abroad. The technologies, the backdrop and context might be different, but certainly I think there's some ideas that are of interest here, particularly as we go forward. And in Italy, in Milan, for example, there is a daily congestion charge for vehicles entering the city centre. That particular topic isn't something that's on the agenda in Ireland yet, but it was recognised in developing that in Milan that there would be an exemption for disabled parking permit holders. Again, the purpose of its congestion charge was to discourage private car use where there are alternatives available, walking, cycling, public transport. But it recognises that a disabled driver does need the ability to get somewhere more centrally and mightn't have access to the other options. In the Netherlands and UK, in Amsterdam and London, some areas have recently introduced emissions-based parking charges, and again, that's something that I think might not be too far away in the Irish context as well. But there were exemptions built into that scheme for holders of disabled parking permits. Again, recognising the need for motorists with those mobility needs to be able to drive into more central areas and park there. Another example from the UK is that there's a number of accessible parking apps now available. I haven't seen anything really gain too much traction in Ireland yet, but these apps can provide information on the location and the availability and the features of accessible parking spaces. In some cases, that can be like a real-time view if you've got the right sensor technology in place. In Singapore, while the UK example I just mentioned is a kind of a customer-facing app, in Singapore, they've developed kind of smart parking sensor technology that detects when an accessible parking space is occupied or is misused. And I know some local authorities in Ireland are trialing this kind of sensor technology right now. What the sensors can basically do is show you in a real-time map view if your accessible spaces are being used. They can't detect if the user has got a permit or not to do so, but they can flag, for example, if someone has overstayed in a space, which, depending on your local arrangements, you might be interested in, or they can detect if a particular category of vehicle is parked at the space. For example, if it's a truck or a delivery van or something like that. And then a final example is in Japan, where now they're actually using cameras and automated systems to enforce accessible parking. And anyone who violates that, they get a fine automatically. So just to kind of summarize the various bits and pieces I've mentioned there, the key considerations that you really need to think about when you're developing your transport mobility policies and when you're looking at accessible mobility and accessible parking, I suppose the strategy and context is your starting point. It's very important to be aware that there is national policy context there and a national support and mandate really to prioritize accessible parking as part of your transport strategy. I think it makes sense, and I think it's certainly the right thing to do where you have got alternatives available for, as I mentioned, those who are lucky enough to not need to use those accessible spaces. Again, you need to. The second piece is to think about the design standards for your accessible spaces. There's lots of resources available there, as I've mentioned, and it's important to be aware that they're there. The communication and education and consultation is really important as you're making changes and developing changes. I think we talked about communication on a previous webinar as well, but explaining why you're making certain changes. Explaining why, for example, parking may be limited in parts of your town centre, but you've introduced more accessible parking spaces because you've got a category of user that needs to take their car, and you've got a category of user that needs that access to the central space. And finally, I suppose a key consideration is enforcement, and making sure that it's consistent. I know it's particularly around disabled parking permits. It's a tricky area, and Tony will talk about this in a second. But it's not difficult to make sure that your enforcement policies are consistent and appropriate, and that your enforcement teams get the right training and education about how to enforce, and also understanding the benefits of the technology, like the things I've mentioned, the sensors and cameras and so on. If you've got any questions about those, I'm happy to share that afterwards. So that's it from me. For now, I'm going to hand over to Tony. Tony, as I said earlier, I'm delighted he could join us. He's National Transport Manager at the Irish Wheelchair Association. He looks after various things. Tony, I'll let you talk through your own bio, perhaps, and as I'm firing up the presentation here. So, welcome, Tony.
Thanks very much, Alan, and good afternoon, I think, at this stage to everybody on the chat here today. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with everybody. I suppose I'm based in the National Mobility Centre in Clane, and the Irish Wheelchair Association is one of the issuing authorities for the disabled parking permit. We also run a nationwide service for motorists with disabilities, where we teach people to drive or make sure that people can return to driving after an illness or whatever happens in terms of some type of a medical issue that arises. So we also run a nationwide accessible transport fleet. So we've got 160 buses going up the highways and byways of Ireland on a daily basis. So that's where we're coming from. So that's grand there, Alan. If you want just to move on there,
sure.
Just to talk about the disabled parking scheme first. I suppose it's the disabled parking permit scheme is underpinned legislatively by the 1997 Road Traffic Act. I think prior to 1997, various local authorities actually used to issue disabled parking permits. So when this legislation came in, it was designed, I think, to put a more coordinated approach to it, and it also allowed for the legal, I suppose, development of the scheme, but also allowed then for that legally as well for the provision of accessible bays for disabled parking permit holders. The permit itself is designed in accordance with EU legislation. Go to the next one there, Anne. There we are. Just in 2010, the scheme itself, there was a very significant review done, and there was revised medical criteria. And it was something we were looking as an organisation for a long number of years, because prior to this, there was very much a feel that the medical criteria were very liberal. And I suppose to be blunt enough about it, maybe people were getting permits who possibly may not have deserved so. So in 2010, after that review, new guidelines for GPs were issued. Okay, Alan, whenever you're ready. The two issuing it, there's two authorities in the country which are provided under legislation to issue the permits. One is ourselves. We issue them from our offices here in Clane, and also the Disabled Drivers Association are the other issuing authority, who are based in Ballandine in County Mayo. So just some little, I suppose, the more minute details in relation to the scheme. Schemes what differentiates the permits which are issued from the IWA and the DDAI. We frequently get queries from parking wardens or general public or guards in relation to these scenarios. So W denotes IWA permits, so it'll be W, and actually there's a bit of a typo which I just see here now. D denotes DDAI permits. So it should be D 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So
You
D W.
You've been up here for a while.
Sorry.
Sorry, folks. Is anybody not on mute? If you could all mute yourselves, please.
So the W is for the IWA permits, and the D is for the Disabled Drivers Association permit. The permit is designed to an EU format. The permits are issued for 2 years, and the photograph is not displayed. And that's often an issue where question we're asked, why isn't somebody's photograph? Because it would make it possibly easier for enforcement agencies. But that is this is the prescribed format that we're required to follow under EU legislation. And it arose from, I think, lobbying by disability groups at the time, where people felt vulnerable that their photograph would be publicly displayed on a car, and that's understandable, I think, So that's something that's just frequently comes up. So if you want to move on there again, Alan. On it as well, just some of the other features of the permit. There's a security hologram, and that's obviously designed fraud, because it's an issue which is frequently arising. People copying and forging permits, and permits are required to be returned on renewal after 2 years expiry date, and also at the time of when somebody's making application for first-time applications, you're also required to get GARDA certification. So if you want to move there again, Alan, whenever you're ready. Thank you. And again, and obviously, but sometimes this can get a bit get lose in translation. The permit can only be used when the permit holder is a driver or passenger at the time of the permit is being displayed. Okay, so basically the permit holder must be in the vehicle, must be part of the journey. Okay, sometimes people say they're going out shopping for the permit holder and all this sort of stuff. It can't be used in that scenario, right? Okay, and it's only legally relevant to public spaces, as you know, but in reality, an awful lot of commercial parking companies and car parks, they recognise the permit, but there's no legal requirement to do so. But in actual practice, a lot of do. Okay, so if you want to go again there, Ella. How do you qualify? There's obviously a medical certification, and there's a few different ways. First one is if one has a primary medical cert, which is a certificate which is awarded by the HSE for people with very severe mobility users. Generally, they will be wheelchair users. If you're certified by the National Council of Blind, and the third one, which is the most common way for people to qualify, is that you're certified by your GP. I want to go again there, Alan, please. And the GP, the medical conditions, there's 5 general areas that people can qualify under the GP category, and it's under the respiratory, the cardiovascular, arthritic, neurologic, or orthopedic. And I suppose one of the underlying conditions for all permits to be issued, it must be a permanent condition which severely restricts an individual's ability to walk. In recent years, and you know, I'm sure your wardens and people on the ground parking level can vouch for this. There has been a very significant increase in permits issued, and currently between the two organisations, there's possibly about 110,000 about 110,000 permits in live permits in circulation. So it's a lot of permits out there. Janella. Abuse, and regretfully with the scheme there is a high level of abuse, and possibly, and we don't have any scientific proof to back this up, but judging on the number of phone calls that we get in here on a daily basis and emails and stuff, which is very, very frequent, where people are complaining about somebody abusing a permit, probably the level of abuse is actually increased, particularly since post-COVID. Okay, so there seems to be an increase in it. So obviously the first one, somebody parks in a bay without any disabled permit. Okay, very straightforward. Somebody doesn't do it. In fact, I live in Naas, and I just recently came out with just, in fairness, I just was getting out of my own car, and somebody saw a car that had pulled into a disabled bay without a permit, and luckily enough the warden was there. In fairness, he issued a fine straight away. So it was great to see. But we do get frequent communications from people around the country saying that there is, poor levels of enforcement of disabled bays in relation to people who don't display disabled permits. Second most common abuse, and this is a huge area, is by family members using a permit. And regretfully, it's often family members of people with very severe mobility problems, and it's a huge problem. And recently, only last week, we had three permits seized by Gardaí in Dublin, and they're related to people using family members who had recently deceased. Okay, so that, which is, you would think wouldn't happen, but unfortunately it does. And thirdly, which is quite common, we come across this literally every day of the week, is forged or copy permits. Okay, very, very common. Okay, and sometimes they make a mistake. With a guy who got caught in recently in an area where he didn't realize that the permits have only got a 2-year expiry, so he put the expiry date down as 2028, which was a bit of a giveaway. So anyway, that's where that is. So I suppose one of the big things that I'd like to get across to people here today, and I'm sure many of you will know, but I suppose it's no harm just to try and re-emphasize it, is the importance of the permit and the importance of accessible spaces for people with disabilities. And that covers obviously passengers and drivers with disabilities. Convenience is very, very important, but it's not just about proximity. Okay, the dimensions of the space are critical for an awful lot of people, particularly people with higher level of disability, who need wider door opening. They need to transfer their mobility aids, be they transferring in and out of a wheelchair, be they, whatever. And there's so many people, there's so many different aids now coming on there, and some of them are quite bulky. Okay, whether they're frames or sticks or whatever. Okay, and so it's very important that people have access to these bays which have the wider dimensions. Right, and sometimes people will think it's just about convenience. It's the dimension for many people is far more critical than proximity, particularly for wheelchair users. Okay, and it's also critical then when they get out of the vehicle that they have the space, that additional space which is in the accessible spaces. It gives them the room to maneuver when they go outside the vehicle. Okay. Thirdly, which is hugely important, is the space is critical, right? Infrastructure for people. If spaces aren't available for many people, they cannot complete their journeys. Just can't be done. They can't do their shopping. They can't go to get their medical appointments, whatever, unless they have access to those spaces. And probably associated with this in terms of that as well would be, it's very important that the environment around the accessible spaces is accessible. So in other words, you'd frequently see disabled parking spaces, but the curbs are not dished around it. So sometimes people have to maybe go out onto a road and putting them under danger. Or you can often see sometimes a disabled space, you know, where there's a slope on a hill, which makes it very difficult, particularly for wheelchairs, getting in and out of a vehicle, or if they're located on the corner of a busy junction or something like that. So there's all those little things we'd urge people to consider. Okay, so thanks, Anna. Go again. Fines, as you know, currently it's 150 fixed charge notice for parking without a permit in an accessible space, and then it's 200 if you illegally use a permit to park in disabled space. E.g., I suppose the most common one there would be a family member. Let's stop there. So, folks, the biggest challenges that we see, and this is based from feedback from our own members and also from the general public, right? And from, I suppose, from our own direct experience as well in this area. The enforcement by both Gardaí and by local authorities is very inconsistent, right? So in some locations it can be very good, in other locations it is, you know, it's lower than what one would expect. Okay. In scenarios as well, we come across is that there's a lack of knowledge about the disabled parking scheme in many areas and in many locations. And I suppose thirdly, one of the biggest challenges that we would frequently get back as well is, and Alan alluded to the percentage spaces there at the start of the chat, is the lack of accessible spaces. So in some locations, there's a dearth of accessible spaces provided for people. That's it, Alan.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony.
Thank you very much.
So folks, I'll just stop sharing that now for a second, and Tony, thanks for taking us through the detail of that. I think that there's certainly a lot of elements of that'll resonate with the audience here today.